Thanks, Tiffany, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. A lot has happened since we began this series of conversations with Michael Pollan back in early October. Since then, Colorado voters approved a ballot measure to legalize facilitated psilocybin sessions in that state. In Oregon, a large number of small counties voted to opt out of allowing legalized psilocybin centers to operate within their auspices, after voters statewide had 2 years earlier approved a measure to legalize psilocybin products and services in the state. In that same time, a peer-reviewed analysis of the largest psychedelic clinical trial to date from Compass Pathways was released. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has been a leading force for years in pushing for clinical research of psychedelics, has been progressing its trials for MDMA, ecstasy, in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the NIMH, the largest funder of mental health research in the world, has announced new guidelines for applicants seeking funding to study psychedelic therapies. With me today to discuss all this and more is Josh Hardman, the founder and principal of Psychedelic Alpha, a consultancy focused on psychedelics, and Dick Simon, co-founder and CEO of Sensorium Therapeutics and chair of the Advisory Council for the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Mass General Hospital. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to talk briefly about how you got into the psychedelic space and what you're doing now. Dick, let's begin with you. How did you get interested and how did you begin working in this area?
Sure. So I got interested. I knew nothing about the psychedelic space. And I got interested when a very close friend's son's life was essentially saved by psychedelics. He was suffering from a host of different mental health conditions, including suicidality, and the prognosis was somewhere between totally grim and horrible. And so they out of desperation reached out and had him work with someone utilizing psychedelics. And he went from someone who with that horrible prognosis to a vibrant human being leading a totally normal life with relationships and work and everything else. So that just opened my eyes to the possibility. Then I became more curious and started taking a look at some of the early trials that were being done. And I was like, well, we have mental health issues in our family. So I was very conscious of the need for better tools. And, no matter what your resources or whatever, the medicines that we are currently using traditionally for psychiatric disorders leave a tremendous amount to be desired. So that got me on this pathway. I had done prior work around sort of destigmatizing and helping people communicate. So I thought this could be a great opportunity to get involved and help those who understand the potential benefits of psychedelics communicate with those who grew up on just say no and your brain on drugs. And have that communication be both ways. So that led me to a lot of things, including MGH and Sensorium that we can talk about in a bit.
Great. But while we're at it, let's talk a little bit about MGH and the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. What is it and what's your role?
So I'm chair of the Advisory Council at Mass General Hospital, which is Harvard Medical School's primary teaching hospital, Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. And the center is led by Dr. Gerald Rosenbaum, who had been running psychiatry at MGH for 20 years. So he's either the premier or one of the premier psychopharmacologists and psychiatrists in the country or world. And the opportunity for MGH and Harvard to get involved was really incredibly exciting for two very different reasons. One is when they get involved, it's an incredible research organization, and you know that great things will be learned and ultimately people will be helped. But the second is in terms of destigmatization, the brand of Harvard Mass General Hospital certainly helped establish additional validity of the space. I mean, Harvard is where Timothy Leary started the path that ultimately led to prohibition for 50 years.
Yeah, and sort of got driven out of Harvard, and now Harvard's back in the space. So that when you say established, you're also that word expands into establishment. So I guess that's kind of a signifier of establishment acceptance of
Sure.
psychedelics.
Acceptance of the possibility of, I mean, to be clear, MGH is not in this to advocate for, they're in it to research about. And as you research, you start seeing things and you're like, no, we should be looking at this a lot more. And why is this working? And how can it work better?
Great. And Josh, same question for you. How did you get involved in this space? And then tell me a little bit about Psychedelic Alpha.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rob. My story of psychedelics kind of starts at an institution that has perhaps a warmer history of psychedelics, UC Berkeley. I was there on my year abroad as a 20-year-old student, coming from a quite an uptight family and a quite middle-class rural part of England. And suddenly I was, lurched into the world of the counterculture in Berkeley. My academic advisor there sent me out with a list of names to speak to hippies, the Black Panthers, the SF Mime Troupe, and basically just to sit with them with a dictaphone and talk to them about, why this apparently spontaneous cultural and political awakening happened in the mid-century. And every question I asked them, trying to force it in a kind of more structural political economic analysis route, every time I tried to do that, they kept coming back to drugs, right? And to me, this was kind of a tired cliche, right? The counterculture, psychedelics, flower power. But the more I spoke to them, the more I became interested in the role of psychedelics in the kind of cultural and political awakening in the mid-century. But ultimately, was forced to drop it. Came back to England, went on to work in research institutes and economic analyses, and all quite kind of boring stuff. But all the while, in the back of my mind, I had this interest. And then imagine my surprise when I came across VCs, investors, biotechs, and institutions like King's College London, Imperial College, and obviously now Mass General, looking at psychedelics. It just seemed like the total opposite to what I'd seen with, ravers, the underground hippies and indigenous folks. And now you have, the cold, hard fluorescent light of the laboratory looking at this. So to me, at first, my main interest, 4 years ago or so, was in this interplay and this juxtaposition in these two routes to kind of psychedelic saliency. And I could see a lot of ways that these two groups, weren't going to get on. So at first that was my interest, but then ironically, I became very interested and kind of a proponent of, the benefits of the medical model to some people, right? It's perhaps, more propitious to getting coverage from, institutions like the NHS. So I kind of went all in and started tracking these companies. And that's basically what Psychedelic Alpha does. We keep tabs on psychedelic businesses, psychedelic research, and we do some consultancy as well. But yeah, so I kind of came in as a skeptic of, this kind of commercialization of some people have called it of psychedelics, but came to see, the benefits of, the biopharma model in terms of, providing access and also getting these drugs approved by institutions that, have traditionally been very terrified of these, drugs or substances for the last 50 years. So that's kind of my arc and what I'm doing now.
Great. And just to be clear, with Psychedelic Alpha, you advise some companies, but you don't personally invest. So you're not your research findings and analysis isn't tainted by personal investment.
Yeah, we're funded out of my own pocket. We don't have any shadowy funders. So yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So let's go through some of the developments I mentioned at the top, and maybe we can start with the review in the New England Journal of the COMPASS Phase 2 trial. This is the use of psilocybin for serious depression that hasn't responded to other therapies. Josh, you've written about this. Can you walk us through the findings?
Yeah, so effectively the publication was just the peer-reviewed findings of the top-line results that were published last year by Compass Pathways. It's a phase 2b study. The company has since announced their phase 3 program. Essentially, they were giving one session of psilocybin therapy along with preparatory sessions and integrative sessions afterwards of just normal therapy. And that was given to people with treatment-resistant depression, the kind of worst of the worst, people who have already tried, 2 or 3 other lines of treatment, so SSRIs or normal talk therapy. The findings were about 1 in 5 people were sustained responders, meaning that they had a significant decrease in their rates of depression at week 12. I think to some people they're kind of surprised when they hear that, because 20% doesn't sound that amazing or disruptive or transformative. I guess it's worth reminding listeners that this is a very difficult to treat patient population. But also, when these results were announced initially last year, the company's stock price took a huge dive, because not only alongside these somewhat lackluster efficacy findings, there were some kind of concerning safety signals with serious adverse events in the treatment-resistant depression patients. So, there's some element of like, these things are to be expected. It's very hard with this patient population. They're very vulnerable to things like suicidal ideation, but there are, genuine questions which the company is now going to have to resolve in phase 3. But yeah, that's kind of a summary. So about 1 in 5 people were sustained responders to psilocybin therapy, which is, quite significantly less to, for example, what we're seeing in MDMA therapy for PTSD, which is about 2/3 of responders. So yeah.
And in terms of the adverse effects, what was the rate of adverse effects?
I don't actually know. Do you know, Dick? I think it was.
I don't recall, but I'd emphasize that it's a really difficult, TRD, or treatment-resistant depression, is a really terrible thing. And suicidality, unfortunately, in that population is just a constant concern. There are people where nothing else is helping, and that's where even the 20% number, which is nothing like what MAPS achieved, certainly, these are people where nothing else is helping them. So it's progress. It's not block, and there are such high expectations. I think part of I think the stock price hit came from there were massive in the entire space. Sometimes there's a panacea sense, and when no, it's good, it's helpful. It doesn't help everybody, but it helps some people who otherwise aren't helped. That gets lost in the but this is supposed to cure everything instantly.
Right. Well, I want to talk about that a little bit more later. It is interesting to me. I covered the stem cell space a lot in the 2000s, and you saw the same kind of what was the term, just excessive enthusiasm for that space, and cures within years, and things haven't quite panned out that way, obviously. Anyway, let's move on from there. I want to hear a little bit about maybe briefly touch on the MAPS findings with MDMA, and where that stands. And I think MAPS has announced some, that they're going to, well, I know they're looking at they've had a phase 3 trial, correct?
Yeah, they've wrapped a second one. Yeah,
they've had a second phase 3 trial, and looking at potential approval, FDA approval in as little as a year, maybe longer, right?
That's great. Yeah. They just
finished. Do you want to talk a little bit about those trials and what they found?
Yeah, I can go ahead, and then Dick, you can fill in the gaps. So yeah, MAPS just announced that they finished their second phase 3. So altogether, they've had around 200, just shy of 200 patients in a phase 3 program. So they'll hope to submit their new drug application to the FDA probably the first half of next year, if all things go well. And then as you said, Rob, MDMA could be an approved treatment for PTSD in the United States, in North America, by as early as kind of 2024. So that's really promising. And I think, as Dick alluded to, like, the results in MDMA therapy for PTSD are really stunning. From this first phase 3 that we have data for, which showed around 2/3, I think 67% of participants were in remission. And these are people with, in the first trial, with really severe forms of PTSD. I think average duration was something like 7 years of really terrible PTSD, and having tried many other therapies. I think one interesting thing to note, and maybe it might be interesting to Mindsight readers and listeners, is that even in the group that received the placebo, so they didn't receive the MDMA therapy, they still saw about 1/3 of patients in that group recovering from their PTSD, despite having tried therapy in some cases many times before, which I think just goes to show how stellar the therapy was and how intensive it was for this group. Some of that might be related to expectancy, like the excitement around receiving such a novel and hyped therapy. But I personally think that a lot of it is just just shows that as a, I can't say as a nation because I'm here in the UK, but as a world, we need to be investing and funding proper therapy just as much as we invest in, psychedelic therapy. So that's just my soapbox, but yeah.
And I think what you're getting at there is the fact that people didn't just get the drug, they also got companion therapy with it. So either the power of placebo is really strong, or the therapy is a really critical component,
Yeah.
or more likely both.
Yeah, I would say rather than or and.
Yes, exactly. Okay, great. And then finally, and this may be another Josh question, the NIMH guidance that was issued just recently around, so the NIMH, along with NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, has begun funding just in the last couple of years preclinical and clinical research of psychedelics, and that's really a first in the US, or at least since the 60s.
Right.
So without getting too deep into the weeds, Josh, what does the new NIMH guidance say, and where do you both see federal funding going for psychedelics?
Okay, yeah, I think I wrote like a 40 tweet thread on it, which is, vanishing from my memory now, but effectively NIMH was saying that, they're glad to fund psychedelic research and even preclinical research, but what they're frustrated with is the use of animal models and making too many assumptions on animal models like rat models to the effects that we're going to see in humans. Because obviously, there's translational difficulties with, working from animal models then going into humans, but especially in neuropsychiatry. I mean, we have, some models for understanding whether a drug's psychedelic in rats, like we can give it to rats and the amount that their head twitches suggests whether it has a psychoactive effect in humans. And that's kind of well validated. But once you start trying to identify an antidepressant effect of a drug in a rat, the translatability quickly kind of falls off a cliff. So I think that was NIMH's main push. And they advocated for a reverse translational approach. So you have to have some sort of idea of what it looks like, what efficacy looks like in a human, and then you might be able to go back to kind of animal models for a different drug or like a tweaked version of the drug. So it's quite technical, but it was also positive, right? The fact that NIMH is even putting out guidance about psychedelic research suggests that they've been getting enough applications for funding that it's worth clarifying their position on it. And yeah, to that point, I guess the funding that there has been for psychedelic research over the last 50 years has mainly been on their abuse potential. And in the case of MDMA, there's studies that have actively tried to prove that it is toxic. And there was one famous study where it turned out they're actually giving people methamphetamine, and it was misstated as MDMA, and that was what people used for a long time to say MDMA was toxic. So now we are at least seeing more kind of honest interest from these agencies in funding psychedelic research. But I think Dick can probably explain how minuscule it is compared to.
Right. I mean, so there is some funding, which is great, because for a long time there was no funding. So I choose to view that as progress, but against the scale of other funding, it's barely beginning. A $30 million grant is a big deal. But against the scale of what NIMH and NIH otherwise would be funding, we're just seeing the start of it. To this point, almost all of the funding is still coming from philanthropic or commercial dollars. And in other areas of health, that's no longer true.
And can either of you put that into numerical terms at all? Like what's the universe of funding for psychedelics? How much of it's private? How much of it's government? Is the European Union doing anything in funding?
No, not really. No. In terms of, we track the amount of fundraising in both public and private rounds amongst companies. And last year it was just shy of $2 billion. This year it's quite a bit less, with, rounds like Dick's company Sensorium being the outliers this year, these large private rounds. But yeah, it's probably, a few billion in the last couple of years of private investment. And then philanthropy is, a few $100 million, probably, maybe more. But then in terms of, state investment, it's in the order of, it's under 100 million. Worldwide, probably. Australia's government, for example, made headlines by giving 15 million to MDMA and PTSD research. So yeah, it's very small government involvement. And on the philanthropy side, Dick, maybe you have a number, but it is dwarfed by private investment now, right?
I mean, it's in the hundreds of millions, but it's nowhere near. And until the sequencing was really until you had a few commercial players, 100% of the funding was philanthropic. And then quickly the commercial players demonstrated that there is commercial possibility, and there was a flood of funding into that space. Really, Compass and Ties going public did a lot to launch that and have a lot of both public company funding, but also a tremendous interest and high valuations in early stage companies. A lot of that has shifted now. I mean, just with changing market conditions, but.
So a lot of that early philanthropic funding went to MAPS, which really drove this engine.
Yeah, and now MAPS is, having to look at more innovative kind of financing models, because, some early philanthropists at MAPS are now saying, why would we donate money to MAPS when we can invest, or we can offer you a loan, which is kind of a shame, right? Because it could have been this incredible instance of a nonprofit who took a drug all the way through to approval. But in the last kind of 100 million that they need to commercialize, go through that whole commercialization process, they're having to solicit loans and kind of different, project-based financing models. So it's kind of interesting, like to Dick's point, like it's shifted so far that you literally have people saying, why would I donate when I can invest? Which is interesting. And obviously some stuff is lost through that, right? There's a huge focus on clinical research now. There's a real difficulty in getting funding for more fundamental and basic science, which is obviously super important. But when you can invest in a company that's going through clinical trials, it's kind of a lot more sexy and exciting for investors. So I think, something is lost when we lose, philanthropy's interest, but I don't know, maybe there's ways of keeping them involved with things like MGH and these projects.
Right. I mean, MGH, or you were earlier referring to Berkeley, which also has an active center, and many leading institutions now have them, and they are garnering. You're also seeing that a lot of philanthropic dollars are going in as philanthropy, but as advocacy dollars for initiatives like Colorado and elsewhere. So originally, some people were looking at, all right, medical is the only way to get this approved. And so for some people, it's become, all right, well, that's one way. And, some are very strongly in favor, some are concerns about it, but, so they're putting their efforts into different policy initiatives.
Okay. Well, since we're on the subject of philanthropy and nonprofits and donations, I'll just pause here for a moment to say that Mindsight News, which is the only dedicated journalism site in the country that's focused solely on mental health reporting, we are nonprofit and we depend on our readers and supporters to keep us going. Right now, we're in a matching period because we're members of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and through the end of December, every dollar we raise is matched dollar for dollar. So you could help us out and help us build our capacity to keep reporting on this space and on mental health therapies and policy in general. You can go to you can also sign up for our daily newsletter by going to mindsightnews.org and clicking to subscribe or to donate or both. And back to the interview. Dick, let's talk a little bit about Sensorium. You're the CEO of the company. It's a privately held company that's doing something pretty unique, using AI, a library of psychoactive plants, and induced pluripotent stem cells to develop psychedelic compounds as therapies. So tell us more about this approach.
Sure. So the idea and the founders came together through work that was being done at or through meeting each other through MGH's Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. And the concept is that everyone is focused on the dozen or so, depends on exactly how you count them, psychedelics that people are focusing on: psilocybin, LSD, iboga, etc. What if we looked instead, and over time that area will be well served. I mean, it's unclear who's ends up being the sole winners, the losers, but there's a lot of activity in that space, and there's significant commercial funding, as well as philanthropic. Our thesis is that what people are not doing is looking at we originally thought hundreds, and it's turned out to be thousands of plants and fungi that have a long history of human use for a range of different mental health or other central nervous system conditions. So we're taking that white space and we've created, we're calling it the Biodynamic Discovery Platform, but it's a platform for analyzing and systematically evaluating out of that universe of thousands of plants and fungi, what is the active molecule that's creating the effect? First, we're creating, as you mentioned, the Neuronatural Library, which will become the largest compilation of plants and fungi that have psychoactive effect. Psychoactive, but not psychedelic, to be clear. We are then
Does that mean that if it's psychedelic, it's excluded from the library?
We're not focusing on the dozen or so molecules and related analogs that others are. It's not automatically excluded, but that's not the area that we're focusing.
Okay.
To the extent we come up with something interesting, we'll certainly,
So it's not an exclusion criteria, but it is the psychoactive is an inclusion criteria.
Right. What we're looking at, a lot of the effect of psychedelics is related to neuroplasticity, or the brain's ability to change, and they tend to accelerate that change dramatically. Some people refer to it as if you have a bad, if you're depressed, say, that there's a rut that you have gotten into. Almost if you using like a ski mountain metaphor, you're always going down the same way. It's a tried and true rut. It's not great, but it that's how you're going through your day. And this is like 4 feet of fresh powder laid on top of that, and enables with therapy the opportunity to have other routes down that are different and potentially better. So what we're doing is utilizing induced pluripotent stem cells that you were referring to, are essentially skin cells that can be converted into nerve cells or neurons, to figure out what's the mechanism of action. How are these things working, these thousands of plants and fungi that we're looking at? What receptors in the brain, how much occupancy, a lot of other ways of evaluating their potential use as pharmaceuticals in a modern context. This creates a massive amount of data on each of the substances. You have a tremendous amount, and then you have a lot of substances. So when you're all through with it, it's a tremendous amount of data. And we're using machine learning through something we're calling SiteGraph to distill all of that down into what are the leads that we ought to be looking at. Our first drug, for example, is related to anxiety, treating people with anxiety. And right now, the primary two pharmaceuticals that are used for anxiety are either SSRIs, which are also used for depression, that don't work for a third of the people at all, no matter what combinations you're trying. And for those where it does work, 40% of those people experience serious side effects that inhibit a number of life activities, ranging from weight gain to sexual dysfunction to a range of other things. And the other are benzodiazepines, which are very, very difficult to get off, are addictive, and are often misdirected. So to give a sense, in the US alone, even though doctors hate benzodiazepines and are concerned, is this like the next opioid crisis, et cetera, there were 90 million prescriptions last year for benzodiazepines to 30 million patients in the US. So there's tremendous need. And our model is we will develop better drugs without a lot of the toxic or other undesirable side effects. And again, our first one is related to, it's a powerful anxiolytic. It needed additional medicinal chemistry so that it can be used in a contemporary context as a pill a day model, rather than being a tea you had to sip all day or a bark that you chew on, because people just don't go into their offices chewing on bark all day. But these are people who desperately need help. And that's the idea behind Sensorium. And we recently raised, as Josh was mentioning, a $30 million Series A in an otherwise very difficult financing environment, which we took as a tremendous validation for what the team is doing, the idea behind the company, and the progress that we're making.
So in that first compound, what is the compound, and where did it come from?
It comes from a succulent. It's an alkaloid coming out of a succulent that has been used for an extended period of time. And there are things that needed to be done to make it appropriate to be a current medicine. But
Interesting. And then, in terms of the use of iPSC derived neurons. So again, the process is taking adult skin cells from a living human, and then, essentially chemically and genetically forcing them back to an embryonic-like state. And then you have those neurons with you can test compounds. Are you also building, is it just neurons, or are you also developing, sort of neuronal networks?
Neurons, we will be developing also neuronal networks, or sort of mini brains, sometimes they're called. And also, those are the two major areas. Then we're looking for plasticity coming out of those neurons based on different compounds.
Great. Really interesting.
Yeah, and the animal model comment from earlier, one of the biggest problems in development of drugs for psychiatric issues is animal behavior does not, and response does not translate well into humans. Unlike other things like oncology or cancer, animals can be pretty good predictors of what will happen. But head twitch, yes, it's indicating something, something that is occurring, but your models for depression, like forced swim, they indicate something, but the reason that the field it has been so difficult is that the animal models just don't translate well. And drug development now is often well, if we can hit this receptor with a molecule that isn't toxic, that might help. And that's why the FDA has for CNS drugs, there's a 56% failure rate at phase 2. Which is a horrible number. And we're looking at doing it very differently. If you start with what at least has strong signals of efficacy, or simplistically with what works, reverse engineer and enhance that, we should end up with very different results.
Interesting. I'm curious though, speaking of animal models not predicting human activity, and areas where there's been massive investments in therapeutics that really haven't paid off. What is the potential? I haven't really read much about this. It may be there, but the potential for psychedelics in dementia and Alzheimer's.
I can say a word. I think now in general in the space, we're seeing this shift from the kind of Trojan horse indications, which were mainly mental health related, PTSD, depression, anxiety now. And yeah, we are seeing a move towards, neurodegenerative, even neurodevelopmental disorders. So yeah, I think there's, many researchers that are interested, but it is at a very early stage. And, some of the, assumptions around mechanism of action that Dick mentioned, so things like neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, spine growth, those things, might lend themselves well to something like Alzheimer's or dementia in a targeted way. So there's definitely plenty of interest. I can't think of one company who's doing it in a kind of coordinated way, at least publicly. But yeah, there's plenty of labs. I think Albert Garcia Rameau's lab put out a paper about a year ago talking about the kind of potential of psychedelics theoretically in that area. But maybe Dick, some groups who are working on it? Or?
Yeah, there are research groups working on various non-mental health related issues, Alzheimer's being one of them. There's thought that it may be helpful with Parkinson's. Anything, essentially, if you're able to rewire the brain, anything where the brain isn't or the nerve cells are not working correctly, you may be able to have positive effect. I use may because we don't really know the answers, but the hypothesis seems like it, there's some validity to it. And now we've got to figure out, all right, what's really happening.
Right.
Yeah, and when you stretch that thesis to its extreme, there's even researchers who have discussed, whether in some alternative universe where we had different ethical standards, you might be able to use psychedelics for diseases of consciousness. So people who are in comatose or vegetative states, because sometimes there's a lack of connectivity between different brain regions. Those people might be conscious in some other sense, but they're not able to vocalize or use motor function. So I think Robin Carter Harris, when he was at Imperial, his team put out a paper, discussing that, theoretically, ethically, we might not be able to do this trial, but theoretically, psychedelics could be, potentially useful in these kind of diseases of consciousness. So I think, there is this peculiarly transdiagnostic situation where psychedelics seem to work for many different conditions. And I think on the mental health side, that's mainly because they allow people to, put some fresh powder on the slope, like Dick, put it well. But in these other conditions, it might be something else like neuroplasticity or neurogenesis. But yeah, I think also it's worth pointing that out, because a lot of people I speak to in my world, in England, they say, well, how can psychedelics work for smoking cessation? They also, they also help people with depression and trauma. It seems like, you're very happy with the hammer and you're going around trying to find nails. So I think it is super important to like discuss these unifying theories of consciousness and psychedelics and mechanisms of action to try and convince people that, this is the science. And, that's why the work of, more fundamental research and the work of groups like MGH is, in my opinion, super important, because you have to be able to, we don't know why many drugs work, and you don't have to know to get a drug approved, but we have to have a pretty convincing explanation, right? In my opinion. So
yeah, I would agree with you. And the unifying theory around somehow or another you're changing neuronal activity, individual neurons, networks, et cetera, and that can lead to all types of changes. There are also anti-inflammation potential effects. One group was looking at eye diseases. Nothing to do with consciousness, or certainly on the surface have absolutely nothing to do with consciousness, but it's a pharmacological effect that is seen.
Fascinating. Okay, so for both of you, how are you seeing this space now as an investor, in your case, Dick, or as an analyst, in your case, Josh? The publicly traded companies have taken kind of a beating this year, but that's true of the entire stock market. How do you see psychedelic companies, both large and small, public and private, progressing, and how much of a thinning out process do you envision?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. Yeah, I think it's natural, right? In any industry, you have this kind of period of exuberance that's followed by a kind of, trough where, the wheat gets separated from the chaff. I think it has been a lot more significant, the kind of sell-off in psychedelics, because there was a huge amount of speculative investment early on. A lot of these companies went public incredibly quickly to try and, benefit from a very frothy public market, which has now, come back to bite them, right? The people who are, who should be investing in biotech or biopharma companies should be thinking about it on a kind of 5 to 10 year time horizon. Whereas people buying, Compass Pathways on their Robinhood app are thinking about it more in terms of a trade, right? So I think, this is one of the major issues with how kind of choppy the market has been. There's just a huge number of kind of retail investors owning these stocks, which is really unusual for biotech and biopharma. It's usually institutions and insiders. So I think that's why we've seen so much volatility. But I also just think on a more fundamental level, so many companies that went public in late 2020 and last year were, to put it bluntly, junk, right? They just kind of came out, they press released that they were working on some deuterated form of psilocybin or some modified analog of another known molecule, and kind of, registered a clinical trial with clinicaltrials.gov and went out and raised money. It was incredibly easy. I was working at a fund at the time who was investing in psychedelics companies, and it was, the same pitch deck that was just being recycled, with filed patents. And there's huge benefits in the way that, the patent system works. For example, you can file a patent and for 18 months it's totally secret. So you kind of control the narrative around that patent for 18 months, right? You can tell investors, we've done this, the patent covers all of this. And, whether it gets granted or not, after 18 months, some people have already run off with the money in these public companies. So I think, unfortunately, there was just a lot of kind of, not necessarily bad actors, but there was a lot of opportunism in the public markets of kind of raise money now and kind of worry about the research later. I think that's hugely beneficial now, though, for people like Dick at Sensorium and companies that are trying to raise now that actually do have, very strong scientific founders, a strong focus on, in terms of sources and uses, putting the money to the research as opposed to putting the money to $1 million marketing budget. So I think, now we're in a good situation in terms of the lead candidates are well funded, and kind of some of that more kind of fluffy stuff has been cut out of the mix.
Are you saying Sensorium's in a good space for that? Maybe what you're saying is that the investors are better quality investors now. I mean, the investors are paying more attention, and thus there's more potential for the companies that do survive.
Yeah, and they're also just psychedelic investors, right? Like in the case of Sensorium, Dick can tell us, but like we had a period where all of these companies were being funded by the same pool of psychedelic investors, whereas I think Sensorium and other fundraisers lately show that we're now seeing biotech investors and biopharma investors and life science investors who are way more well-equipped to appraise these companies and give them the huge amount of follow-on financing that they're going to need. But I'll let Dig talk to that.
So in our situation, our lead investor is a group called Sante Ventures, which is roughly $1 billion life sciences fund. Investment fund, and which has been involved in 70 different companies and the like. So they're very sophisticated. They've seen everything before, and their evaluation of us was very thorough, incredible due diligence, and now they're very helpful based on all their experience as we grow the company. So I think that transition. We also have a number of the psychedelic funds involved. Many of them do like a really good job. And we're pleased to have them with us on our cap table, as well as a number of other individual investors. But I think what you've seen is a shift. And again, we're not doing psychedelic; we're doing psychoactive. But I think you're seeing a shift, as demonstrated by Compass, Atai, and some others. That no, this is real science. This is real, FDA. Evaluation, real trials, and the same way that even for the leading companies in the space, things kind of got irrationally exuberant, if you will, in terms of valuation. Some of it fueled by day trading and an expectation that the companies were just not at a stage yet. Not that there was anything wrong with the company. It was just the valuations being put on them would be great 2 years later when they actually had a drug on the market or something. But they weren't. They were in phase 2 or whatever. But that has also gone to an extreme almost the other way, where what's called like the enterprise value, or the value of the company, if you subtract out the cash that the company has, in some situations is 0 or negative, which makes no sense when you have a healthy company doing great research that's advancing. I mean, that's worth something. It may not be worth 2.2 billion or whatever the final number was there, but 0 is absolutely not the right answer.
Right. So what companies do you each see as particularly promising or interesting right now? And I'll let either of you start. In addition, of course, to Sensorium.
Well, everything else is or Josh, please.
Yeah, sorry, Rob, I'm not going to endorse specific companies, but maybe I'll talk about a theme that's interesting to many people, which is this move towards non-hallucinogenic psychedelics. So I think, Dick, you alluded to it in terms of being able to pass out the mechanism of action from the psychedelic effects. But this is a huge area of investment at the moment. Companies like Delix Therapeutics, which Compass Pathways even holds a sizable chunk in itself, has raised many rounds in the last couple of years. And then also DARPA. So I can't remember what the acronym means, but it's the big kind of Defense Advanced Research Project Agency or something in America.
That's it.
Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, I think.
There you go. That was a lucky one. But DARPA gave Brian Roth, who's a researcher at University of North Carolina, they gave him just shy of 30 million to develop these kind of non-hallucinogenic psychoplastogens. So I think this is a super interesting area of research. It's also super interesting culturally, right? We've got to the point where we're trying to see the psychedelic effect as kind of an adverse event for some conditions, right? And in the case of Alzheimer's, that makes sense, right? You probably don't want to give someone who has Alzheimer's or some sort of issue with cognition or cognitive impairment, you probably don't want to give them a psychedelic with the trip, right? We don't know what the outcomes would be, but maybe increasing their neuroplasticity would be beneficial. So coming up with a kind of new molecule, an engineered version of a molecule that removes those effects but maintains the kind of mechanism of action that we think is helpful might be interesting. And it's certainly been very interesting in the last year or two for investors and funders. So yeah, I think companies like Delix Therapeutics are very interesting.
Right, because one of the challenges in therapeutic or medical use of psychedelics is it's an expensive procedure. It's not just the cost of the pill. It is all of the therapy wrapped around it that brings it to tens of thousands of dollars. And for this to become widespread, you need third-party payers willing to pay for that. And my hope and the expectation, I think, is that third-party payers will hopefully be doing this for the very ill, where nothing else can work. But then there are huge numbers of people that just need help, but aren't sufficiently ill, whatever, it's a bizarre, phrase there, but will probably may not be covered for psychedelics, for psychedelic therapy. So what Delix is looking at, and certainly what we're doing, is removing that very significant cost driver, so that if you're able to achieve similar efficacy without all the additional costs, your uptake should be a lot greater, and the number of people you can help, which is really what drives us, will be much higher.
So, there's this idea in psychedelics research and usage, therapeutic usage, about set and setting, and the importance of the cultural context, the physical, logistical context, but also the cultural context of the use. And that, so the argument, is that could be made that part of what's beneficial is in fact the tripping, the hallucinogenic aspects. So how do you see these two things playing out at the same time? One, these sort of compounds being developed that in which the psychedelic aspect is removed or not present, versus the a psychedelic experience with a psychedelic guide who is sort of grounded in some kind of in the cultural tradition, or a joyous, ecstatic tradition, or experienced in guiding people through a consciousness changing, shifting event. How do you see those two things happening in parallel? Are they competitive, or can they happen alongside each other?
They certainly could happen alongside each other. A couple of thoughts there. One is that we don't know. We have a lot of people who have really strong opinions that will assert them as facts in either direction, but we don't yet really know. That remains to be determined. Clearly, there can be benefits of, let's say what Delix is doing or what Sensorium's doing, just by increasing neuroplasticity, you're doing something. And then what you do with that, remain, a lot of things can happen with or without the psychedelic experience. Other certain things like MDMA for PTSD, you're garnering a lot of additional benefits, certainly by the opening working with a therapist. Because one of the great things about what MAPS is doing, or in general, the use of MDMA for PTSD, is people otherwise, if you're traumatized and have PTSD, you can't really revisit the experience. You're re-triggered. It's not a memory, and it's hard for people who haven't suffered from it to understand that. It's not a memory. It's a horrible thing that you go through each time you get close to it. You're not remembering something bad, you're re-experiencing. And under the impact of MDMA, for many people, they are able to actually revisit what happened, and because the serotonin influx and the like, in a way without being triggered, and it then becomes just a terrible, painful memory, but something where you're not re-triggered each time. So in that context, I would suspect, although there's not concrete data, but it seems logical to assume that the psychedelic experience or the transcendent experience that's allowing that may be very important. In others, it's less clear.
And I would think also another example might be sort of the end of life experience that Michael Pollan has written about, and others, of how that helps people who are at that stage sort of shift their mindset and become more comfortable with their departure, or just reframe the experience of life and death.
Yeah, I think there's very obvious, use cases, not even conditions, just situations like the one you just described, Rob, where the kind of experiential, like full psychedelic experience will be incredibly useful. But I do think, there is this kind of concern that, if a more cost-effective drug comes around, we won't get, healthcare insurance coverage or payer coverage for the full-blown experience, because, why would you? So I think if people are concerned about that, which I am, they should also advocate for ending the war on drugs, right? So then we get this situation where we have Colorado and Oregon, which hopefully, at the moment it's still expensive, but hopefully in time will allow for more community-based settings where people can have, the full-blown quote unquote psychedelic experience without having to worry about it being covered by their insurance company or by a payer. And then also the way that I've come to think about this whole non-hallucinogenic psychedelic thing is that we should just think of psychedelics as an entire, toolbox of potential medicines that haven't been adequately explored by like the modern drug development techniques. Obviously psychedelics have been used for hundreds of thousands, millennia, by different groups, indigenous folks, medicinally and spiritually, but we've never really put them under the modern microscope as such, in a way that Dick's company is doing in some senses, to see whether they have other uses. So that's kind of how I think about this new research into inflammation, neurodegeneration. Like, this is just latent potential that hasn't been explored, and I think we can be excited about that whilst also being concerned about pushing the psychedelic experience aside. So yeah, I try and be excited about both, as long as they don't encroach on one another. So.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that we will determine that there are many situations where the psychedelic experience is what is absolutely necessary, and we'll probably find that there are a number where it's not necessary. I mean, it may have other benefits, but isn't necessary to cure a particular condition.
Okay,
Sure.
We've got a couple questions that have come in, so let me bring up one. How long does the results last after going through treatment with psychedelics, especially regarding depression with suicidal ideation for someone who has not been helped when trying everything else?
Yeah, I think this question gets at one of the big issues we have at the moment, which is a lack of, long-term controlled data. So Compass Pathways phase 2b, was the latest and most mature study in patients like the person who's asking the question describes, people with treatment-resistant depression, some of who had experienced suicide ideation. And, that was published a year ago and was just published in the journal, weeks ago. So, those companies are doing long-term follow-ups. But the other issue is, in long-term follow-ups, you can't, stipulate that you can't go back on SSRIs, or you can't seek out psilocybin in the real world, in the kind of decrim context. So it does get muddied. So I think, personally, I think a good opportunity to get some of that longer-term data is in in states like Oregon and Colorado. Obviously, there's concerns around data collection and sensitivity, but I think, I think we'll get some of this longer term data in the real world setting. And I guess, once these drugs, if and when these drugs are approved, at that point, it's just the task of convincing groups like the NHS that the data is long-term enough, and we can start projecting how long someone will be in remission. Because we've seen with esketamine, Johnson & Johnson's Spravato product, that the NHS doesn't cover it because there's only a few years of data of remission. So it is definitely a big issue. And I'm not sure how we can overcome that given the constraints of linear time. But yeah.
And do you have the sense that in Oregon and Colorado is a little early to know, but that they're going to collect data in a controlled, rigorous way? Are there strong plans in place for that? Yeah,
there's very contentious plans at the moment. Actually, it's becoming a big kind of talking point. So Oregon State University was setting up a project to monitor this data in like a anonymized, aggregated way that made it useful. But there's now some talk emerging, and maybe Dick knows more about it than I do, but about concerns around the data privacy, because obviously, imagine a transcript of what you said during your psychedelic experience becoming public or becoming attached to your name or being sold to a third party. People are rightfully concerned, but at the same time, this is an incredible kind of what in social sciences you call a natural experiment, right? Like, it's a huge opportunity. So this work is, being planned to be done, and there's still, a number of months left to get it in place. But now it looks like privacy concerns might kind of knock it off the rails. But I don't know if you know more about that, Dick.
No, I would agree with everything that you just said. One thing though that I would think about, you're talking about noise and data. All right, so how many of the people went back and had additional psilocybin outside of the trial, or how many of them went back on SSRIs, which are very valid concerns. But if you look at it in a macro context, if you end up in a situation where 2 years from now, X% of the people who were otherwise treatment resistant, so nothing was helping them, are no longer depressed. All right, it may not purely be that first dosing session or 3 dosing sessions or whatever, but you've addressed the problem, and then you want to deconvolute the data to figure out what's really going on. And
Yeah.
so
People
it's not going to be perfect data. Even
Right.
if Oregon State University is able to do it, it's still going to be noisy data. But if you get enough noisy data, you can distill it down to useful insights.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah.
So-
And as a shout out, Elliot Marseille, who runs a group at UC Berkeley, out your way, Rob, is doing really incredible work here on the health economics, because it's my opinion, and I think the opinions of many, that approval is just kind of the first step, right? With coverage and access is the next huge step, convincing governments and payers to cover this, because as Dick said, this is going to cost 20-30 grand. So it's not for most people.
Right.
this-
For many people is
Yeah.
So Dick, this is another question that came in that sort of relates perhaps to the neuronal networks and that we were talking about. And the question is, have you considered using organ on a chip technology for research?
We haven't actively really looked into that. But here's what we're doing. So you're using 96 or 384 well plates. So essentially they're not chips, but they're very, very small samples. And you're able to, on a high throughput basis, be able to take a look at the effect of different compounds on them. So it's not technically a chip, but it achieves some of the benefits that I suspect the questioner was asking. How do you do this in a really systematic, high throughput way? And then you have microscopes that are able to, not just see the magnified image, but process that so that you don't need a human being looking at each 96, each image to figure out, all right, there's this much neuronal outgrowth, this much dendritic growth. The computer does that for you. So it's not technically on a chip, but it's
Right.
a
It's in
different
that
way.
direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we just have a couple minutes left. Let's do a quick round robin. I'm interested, what excites each of you the most and what worries you the most about this space? So what could go really right and what could go really wrong in the next year or two? Dick, you want to start?
Sure. So what can go really right is we will have significant positive results from studies indicating that indeed these substances are providing clinically significant positive results, and you see approvals. And then that leads to, well, you can't criminalize something that has no potential medical benefit when the FDA, on the other hand, is pointing out the medical benefit. And even though initially it may be psilocybin and MDMA, it certainly brings into question other prohibition activities. My concern is around potential blowback. There's a lot happening at once. There's tremendous expectations. And there will be, I guarantee there will be adverse events. There are adverse events when somebody drives in their car, or somebody flies a plane, somebody does whatever. And, the hope is that those are put in context and that on balance, there's tremendous progress. But the concern is that we've seen this, unfortunately, we've seen this movie once before in the late 60s and early 70s, and it wasn't bad data or bad outcomes or bad anything else. It was a change in sentiment.
Yeah.
And so that's my concern.
Okay, Josh?
I'm excited about, beyond the late stage trials, what's going on at the federal level in the US. We've seen, state by state, city by city action so far, but now there's this federal task force that's being created, and there's many different groups advocating, at least in the US at national level. Super excited by that. Concern is probably similar to Dick's on the kind of expectancy and kind of hype side of things. I think we need to kind of always zoom out, and whilst the endeavor to find new therapeutics is incredibly important, we need to remember the reasons why people are getting depressed and sick in the first place. And also, just another quick concern is this at-home ketamine boom, which is huge at the moment. People mailing out ketamine to people. Again, it ties into my concern of not being able to zoom out and realize, A, why people are depressed, and B, the risks of just giving people, these drugs and telling them it's going to cure you, you don't need therapy. So I think to some extent, keeping psychedelics in the medical model within a container of good care, good therapy, and well-funded therapy. So yeah, that's my concern.
And last question, a little crystal ball gazing. 5 years from now, how big a role do you think psychedelic substances, or we could say psychoactive as well as psychedelic substances and psychedelic or psychoactive, I don't know, yeah, psychoactive assisted therapy will play in the mental health of people in the US and around the world? Josh?
I think in the medical model, there'll still be third line treatments by then, maybe second line treatments. People will still be, you know, in the first instance, having SSRI antidepressant, but for the tough to treat people, they'll be helped by it. That will create more data that might broaden it out. And I think outside of the medical model, we will have seen hopefully good experiences in decriminalized states, legalized states, and we'll see a lot more attrition on the war of drugs, which will help psychedelics play a role in people's mental health outside of the medical model as well. So that's my optimistic 5-year plan.
Okay. Dick?
I would share a lot of that optimism and plan, you know, with the caution that I cited earlier, that there's a tremendous amount of momentum building. And I think that you will begin to see more and more innovative solutions to something that we just haven't addressed well. We haven't solved. I mean, for some diseases, lithium remains the best medicine that you can take. Lithium has been around for over 50 years. Lithium has a significant impact on the liver, and yet that's what's prescribed because we don't have anything better. So the opportunity to make a huge improvement is definitely there. And I believe psychedelic and other psychoactive medicines will play a really important role in doing that.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks both of you very much. Really interesting conversation. And Tiffany, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, Dick, and Rob, for a great conversation this morning. Everybody, if you'd like to subscribe to Mindsight News, we have the link in the chat. We also have our donation link as well. And for those of you that have tuned in, we'll also be sending an email of the recording. In addition to that, it will be on our Facebook page as well. So,
and everyone should feel free to, once those links are out, feel free to share them and send this interesting interview around to your friends and colleagues.
Thank you.
And with that,
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Bye.